biggest consequences of becoming a desensitized people is that there is no sense of urgency to do something about this. What's happening in Mozambique is everybody's business. If we all following the stats, if you're all following the trends, and that is that democracy is on the decline, that is citizens and governments, there is an increased gap and disassociation between citizens and their governments. When it comes to matters such as what's happening in Mozambique right now, this should be frustrating everybody, and this should be calling everyone to action. If I'm going to take it a step further, it also challenges all of us as individuals in terms of, what some would call selective activism. But let me not, take up too much space. Americo, can you please just, for those who have not catched the video, just a small introduction as to who you are, what you're about, and what are the latest developments since the 9th of October?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me again. As you said, this is a follow-up conversation as we had a conversation. I had the polls that took place in October 9. My name is Americo Maluana. I'm a Mozambique political analyst, and I expect to share some insights on the political landscape and the post-electoral environment in Mozambique right now. And indeed, we held elections in October 9, and in general, the election day was seen as relatively peaceful. But after the election day, there were some concerns raising about the electoral process itself. And I start by mentioning it because most of the things that happened later, mainly the demonstrations or protests that are still taking place, result in the mistrust that people or distrust that people have regarding the way that the election process was managed and the way that election processes have been managed in Mozambique by the election management parties. So I would start, or I would take it from there as a way of starting. And as I said in the beginning, there were some concerns regarding malpractices, regarding misconduct during the polling day. Some people were reporting, and it was also widespread in social media, cases of ballot stuffing, spoiling of ballots, citizens found with pre-marked ballot papers, and unregistered voters trying to vote. So these are just some of the irregularities that were observed during election day. And I said in the beginning that overall the election day was relatively peaceful, but all these malpractices that I've mentioned have triggered and have ignited nationwide protest. And these nationwide protests began even before the announcement of the official results. This is to say that on October 10, the opposition candidate, Venancio Mondlane, which had formed a parallel tabulation voting team to count or to cast the voters, he declared himself as the winner of the election. And it somehow created an environment in which people were expecting it to be confirmed by the official results. But in the same day or some hours later or some days later, when the official channels, the Electoral Commission, started delivering the results, we saw something completely different, and it has somehow ignited this protest. This is to say that the protests in Mozambique against the electoral results were announced prior to the announcement of the official results. And it is worth mentioning that there was a tragic episode which also ignited this protest and demonstration, which was the killing of two opposition party officials. One is Elvino Dias, who was the lawyer of the opposition candidate Venancio Mondlane, and its national officer, Paulo Guambe. So after these two opposition party officials were killed, it somehow ignited nationwide demonstrations as people were somehow frustrated with the way they were killed. And from that moment on, it was not only about the election results, but also about the brutality in the murder of these two political opposition figures.
Mm-hmm.
So now I can say that the things are out of control. The political atmosphere in Mozambique is really bad, is really tense, because we have several rounds of demonstrations. The first two rounds of demonstrations were on the killing of these two opposition figures and the election results. But we also have the second and we also had the second, the third, and now we are in the fourth round of demonstrations. This is to say that from the election day up to now, Mozambique is tense with these demonstrations. There are several casualties due to the brutality of the police. The economy is somehow stuck. I would say that we already have 14 days, 14 effective days with the economic activity completely paralyzed in the country. Yeah, so this is what I can say in a nutshell regarding the post-election atmosphere in Mozambique. So against what one would expect, that okay, there are elections, the results are announced, and the political actors peacefully accept the results. This is not what's happening in Mozambique. And even in the prior discussions we had already said that these elections happen against the backdrop of a tense elections that were held in 2023. So we are seeing the repetition of the same misconduct, malpractice, and protest against the election results.
Yeah. No, as you pointed out, the 2023 elections there were also some irregularities and dissatisfaction and rigging.
Mm-hmm.
This is a two-part question. One, in your observation and analysis, what differentiates these protest actions? What is there, if at all, something different about the level of dissatisfaction that the 2024 election outcome has yielded? And then second to that, two-part question, second to that is to say, what is the consequence of this, if at all?
Mm-hmm.
Like you're saying, 14 days, it's been 14 days of protest action. And obviously, the aim, let me not say obviously, but the aim would be to frustrate people that eventually, initially we saw about 2 days ago that, okay, tensions are settling a bit, but what is the consequence of even from an economic perspective, also from a democratic perspective, and is there something different about these protest actions?
Yes, I would say that there are several differences between the protests that we are having now in the 2024 elections and the protests that we had in the local elections. One of the key differences is that the protests we have now are nationwide. It means that in all the provinces. People are in the streets
Mm.
demonstrating and showing their dissatisfaction regarding the election rigging and several social and economic problems that Mozambique society is facing now. What we see now is that the opposition candidate, Venancio Mondlane, is really challenging the Frelimo party dominance. And his strategy of decentralizing the demonstrations has proven itself to be effective so far, as it is the only way he found to pressure the government, to pressure the system to restore what he calls the electoral truth, the electoral justice. And the point is that everybody, or at least many people, are accepting these claims. So when many people accept the claims, it means that when he calls for demonstrations, although there are people who fear going to streets due to the brutality of the police, people stay at home. By staying at home, it means that the economic activity is somehow affected. And
Mm.
even the small businesses in the countries do not open because although the protests that are called are somehow peaceful protests, they all end in violence. And in several occasions, this violence was sparked or was somehow has as the epicenter the way the police reacts to the demonstration. There are several videos that are circulating in social medias showing demonstrators bowing in knees as a way of showing that they are demonstrating peacefully, but these even showing that they are demonstrating peacefully, the police used the force to rebuke the demonstrators. So it is creating high levels of frustrations. And
Mm.
let's say that these demonstrations are not only about the election results, it is the way people found to voice themselves regarding the continuous political exclusion, lack of good living conditions, lack of good public services at the different domains. So I would say that people find this as an opportunity to voice themselves against all the things that have been happening, not only during the 10 years of President Nyusi governance, but during this Frelimo rule that is has around 50 years now. This is to say that these dissatisfactions that we are having now reflects the need of deep reforms in the governance. And if you see what's happening in many African countries, mainly in Southern Africa regions, you will note that many liberation movements that are ruling parties now are being challenged. And one of the key challenges that they are facing now is the generational shift, because the previous struggle legacy that they had to legitimate themselves in power is being continually challenged due to the suffering that young people have due to the lack of better and inclusive policies. So this is not only about Venancio Mondlane, this is not only about opposition candidate from Podemos. This is about the levels of dissatisfactions that people have been facing during these whole years. And if the system does not react in each elections, we will have the same levels of violence, the same levels of casualties as we are having now.
Yeah. You raise a very valid point there to say that even in cases whereby Mozambicans or citizens have gone on their knees as a symbolic gesture to show that they come in peace and that being met with a lot of hostility and that being met with a lot of violence, which escalates matters, that even when things calm down and simmer down, one of the consequences is this broken trust between security and state forces versus citizens, that opposed to being identified as a protector of citizens, you even post election violence, state security forces will be seen as the enemy of the people. That if I come armless, and this is not to say that there were not there have not been violent incidents. We saw, burning of trucks and buildings and so forth. But that also does not nullify two things. It does not nullify the fact that there are peaceful protests. And in addition to that, what resulted in the violence becoming, in the protest action becoming violent, no protest action, or seldomly, it's very seldom for protest action to just start with violence, but it starts with disgruntlement, and then when they turn violence, that is a result of people feeling unheard and unseen, and will use tactics to try get to try being heard, and by the state, outside state actors and so forth. My question to you is, there's been a lot of SADC's response has been under a lot of scrutiny, and critics argue that the regional body's involvement has been ineffective and limited. How should have SADC responded, and when do you think SADC should have responded?
Well, first, you have raised a very important point, which is state relations, state-society relations of trust. And indeed, one of the immediate consequences of this violence in the protest is that the relations between the state and society is put in jeopardy, and specifically the relations within the police or the security and defense forces and the society. Mozambique has key security challenges. As you know, we are facing violent extremism in Cabo Delgado since 2017, which has resulted in more than 1,000 casualties. I mean, more than 1,000 displaced people and thousands or hundreds of people that were killed. This is to say that the security and defense forces have a key security challenge in northern Mozambique. And now they are challenged to reduce or at least to change the focus from what's happening in Cabo Delgado, which is violent extremism, to focus on what's happening in the urban areas and what's happening in the streets. So this is very problematic, and it is expected that society and the security and defense forces have good relationship, mainly to help the police, for instance, target organized crime or tackle criminality in the society. This is to say that if you have a situation in which citizens do not trust the police, they will not even be able to denounce those criminals that are in the neighborhoods or in the urban areas, because they do not see them as a way of bringing justice or bringing accountable to those who do not comply with the law. So it has not only immediate effects in the trust, but also long-term effects. Reason why I would say that after this world environment of tensions, there is a need of thinking on reforms. There is a need of thinking on how the police can recover the trust from the society. And let's not forget that those police officers that are in the streets to rebuke the demonstrators are also part of the society. When they go home, they are received, they are welcomed by these families that have their sons in the street. So how do you see this relationship? And let me say, that we have casualties not only from citizens that died in the streets in clashes with the demo with the police, but we also have situations in which some police officers were killed by the citizens, were killed by the demonstrators, by the demonstrators. One of the most polemic cases happened in Matola City, in which any officer from the criminal investigation unit was stoned, was brutally stoned by the police. So just imagine a situation in which the communities, in which the society stone a police officer to death. What are we creating? It is more likely to become a urban war in which the police are fighting against the citizens. So it is very dangerous, and I think it is this is an opportunity for the international community. It's an opportunity for SADC and other multilateral actors and other multilateral partners from Mozambique have strong positions in terms of calling for the end of violence and calling also for a peaceful dialogue, calling for a peaceful political settlement, which would somehow entail power sharing due to the levels of escalations that it is having, and due to the consequences and economic impacts it's also having now. Imagine in this in this fourth round of demonstrations, the opposition candidate Venancio Mondlane has called for the sabotage of international trade. He has called for people to demonstrate in the borders. That's why the Maputo South Africa border now is closed, is not
Yeah.
working properly, and we have other borders in central Mozambique, and the main ports that are also not working properly. This is to say that the impacts, the economic impacts are not only for Mozambique, but are also for neighboring country, mainly considering that Mozambique is a corridor. Mozambique serves the interland. Mozambique serves Tanzania. Mozambique serves Zimbabwe, Malawi, South Africa, and many other countries that have their economic dynamics strongly tied to Mozambique. So when we have these situations, the whole region is affected. And I think that in this extraordinary meeting that SADC will have on the situation in Mozambique, they need, and they would have, or they're supposed to have a strong position regarding what's happening, so that we cannot have these problems taking longer, because the economic impacts are very high. We have seen the government saying that we will have in the coming days situations in which the most vulnerable people will be facing hunger. So this is very worrying, and again, it is urgent for us to have a peaceful dialogue, to have a political settlement, so that all this violence may end.
Yeah. There's so much to unpack from what you just said. I'll ask this, and perhaps maybe my two final questions. The first one is the ideal case scenario, given the context of everything, like you mentioned, is a political settlement. What is the probability of the Frelimo party conceding to that? And is there an alternative outside of that, or is a political settlement the only option?
Well, I would say that the political settlement, which entails power sharing, would be the perfect or the ideal scenario. In the beginning of all these demonstrations, we have seen some positions from Frelimo showing openness to dialogue. But recently, we have seen positions from the Ministry of Defense, we have seen positions from the General Commander of the Police and other high-ranked government officials, which show that it seems like the path for dialogue is not being considering by now, is not being considered, is not being considered by now. From the opposition candidate Venancio Mondlane, we have also seen some signs of openness, which are around the possibility of forming a government of national unity. But I would say that this scenario is very uncertain, because I think that um, there is still not a clear strategy from the government in terms of tackling this problem. And um, one of the evidences we can see from that is that they are still betting on the security and defense forces to rebuke or to violently disperse the demonstrators. So it is very unlikely that we follow this path, although we think that it is the best option now. Let's see what happened recently in South Africa after the May election. The ANC has had majority in parliament since the apartheid, but the ANC party dominance was challenged in the last elections, and now we have a government of national unity. So why not considering this as a way of ending this tension and putting the country on track again? Another scenario that is also very unlikely to happen is the nullification of the election. Right now, the opposition parties have 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 called and submitted they have submitted some complaints in the election commissions regarding some disparities between the number of voters for the presidential elections and the province and the parliament elections. There are huge disparities in terms of numbers, which have not been explained by the electoral commission. Now, the Constitutional Council, which works in Mozambique as the electoral court, has also called the National Election Commission to clarify these disparities, and we still haven't a concrete position about these disparities. But overall, these elections were marked by several irregularities, and there are voices calling for the nullification of these elections and the calling for for a repetition of the elections. But again, this is very unlikely to happen. I don't see this scenario taking place, considering the Mozambique political landscape, considering the government position regarding what's going on now.
Yeah. Like you also alluded to this a bit earlier on, and it's an ongoing discussion about the legacy and the future of liberation movements within the continent. If I'm going to be more specific, I would say from a Southern African regional perspective, we saw what happened with the elections of Botswana. The Botswana Democratic Party has been in power since independence, 1966, and this year being somewhat moved out of power. In South Africa, we saw what happened with the May elections, whereby for the first time since 1994, the ANC did not get that majority that it needs to hold, its stronghold on power, therefore resulting in the GNU. We are yet to see how all of these things will influence the elections in Namibia and what happens with SWAPO. With Zimbabwe, we've seen, repeated attempts to get ZANU-PF out of party. So the conversation around the future of liberation movements is twofolded. On the one hand, you have those that argue that there is a deliberate attempt to overthrow and or to destabilize liberation movements. And then on the other hand, there are those that argue that liberation movements are an impediment to democratic progress and effective governance. In your analysis and observation, would you argue that liberation movements at some point in time failed? If so, why? And is the legitimacy to the argument that there is a deliberate attempt to overthrow or to destabilize liberation movements on the continent?
Well, I would say that many liberation movements has failed to fulfill the promises of independence. The liberation movements represented the national unity of the African people to fight against colonialism. But now there is a situation in which the understanding of the people is that there was somehow a replacement of those who were ruling before by others who are African, who are brothers, but they are somehow enslaving the others. So this is somehow the internal perceptions. This is to say that the independence enabled the formation of national elites that have failed in the distribution of power and resources within society. So when you have a situation in which there are resources and there is a growing perceptions that only a small elite enjoys these resources and the other cannot, and the majority cannot have a share on these resources, it brings frustrations. And in the African I mean, not only in the African, but in societies, when you have these disparities among those who have and those who do not have, it somehow triggers frustrations, and frustrations can bring violence in society because it puts people in a situation in which they have nothing to lose. So they engage in protest. Let's say that elections are one of in democracies, elections are the main arena of contestation of power. So imagine a scenario in which this arena of power is somehow captured and it works following electoral authoritarianism dynamics. It means that people have not any other way of voicing themselves against the social injustice that happen, and it puts the society in extreme vulnerability to violence. It puts society in extreme vulnerability to instrumentalizations by internal or external forces to follow their interest. This is to say that although there is any external perspective that is brought to legitimate the level of discredit that society has now in liberation movements, there are internal problems that the liberation movements are failing to tackle. And these internal problems are related with the lack of social justice, are related with the lack of fair distribution of resources, are related with poor governance, corruption, lack of public services in terms of housing, in terms of employment, healthy, and education. Many African countries have chosen democracy, although there was any external environment that has to be considered, mainly looking at the third wave of democratization that sparked almost all African countries. But we must see the democracy as an institutional choice of African countries. And what we can note now is that many of these African countries uh, do not comply with the democratic institutions. They comply only to a level that do not put in jeopardy the status quo. They comply only in the level it does not put in jeopardy the interest of the elites. And this is the problem now. You know, in Mozambique, for instance, you don't imagine what a transition from one government or governance alternation means. It means that many business from the elites of the ruling parties will be put in jeopardy because the economic and the political elites in Mozambique are the same. If you see the if you see the beneficial owners, for instance, of the different business in the mining and the extractive sector, you will note that there is a conflict of interest because those who are in government are also the partners of themselves in the private businesses. So there are many economic and political issues at stake, and it is this grip of holding the power at any cost that is causing all these post-electoral tensions that we have in Mozambique. Regarding the external actors, we know that the countries are not necessarily friends. They act in the sense of maximizing their own interests. And of course, there are many Western countries and other geographies that have interest in Africa, and they've always been studying on the best means of maximizing their interest. But it is not enough. It is before looking at the external dimension, we should also look at what's not working internally. This external approach brings a sense of victimization of these national liberation movements to not comply with the rule of law, to not comply with the rules of democracy. If we have chosen democracy, let's see and let's comply with the costs of democracy. There is a need of seeing or of looking at democracy as a way of bringing bringing the government of holding the government accountable for its action. Let's have a situation in which from 5 to 5 years the citizens can assess the government's governance performance and choose if they want to continue with the same dynamics or they want other alternatives. This is democracy. And if we are not used to uncertainty, which is brought by the elections, it means that we are not ready for democracy, and we will always have winners beforehand.
That's good. In closing off, while we've seen maybe more African countries calling for calmness. South Africa, I think a day or two ago, called for calmness. We hear that, with the extraordinary summit of SADC taking place, not, in a couple of days, that, what's happening in Mozambique is going to be a talking point. How can Mozambique ensure that calmness does not simplify or does not simply mask unresolved tensions, to ensure that you don't have calmness at the expense of not addressing unresolved tensions and underlying issues? Because as you pointed out, yes, it's the dissatisfaction, so to speak, of the election results that sparked these protests, but it goes far beyond the election outcome.
I'm sorry, I couldn't get the question. I don't know if there was a problem with the connection here. May you
Yes,
kindly repeat?
no problem. My question was, there have been increased calls for calmness. We saw South Africa 2 days ago calling for calmness. There's the extraordinary summit of the SADC that's happening in a couple of days, and what's happening in Mozambique is going to be a talking point for that. My question is, with that in mind, how can Mozambique ensure that calmness does not simply mask unresolved tensions? As you noted, that yes, it is contestations of the election outcomes that spark these protest actions, but it goes far beyond that. So how do we make sure that in calling for calmness, we're also ensuring that unresolved tensions are actually addressed?
Well, I think that SADC has not had strong positions regarding what happens in member states. Although there is a need, there is a general rule in international relations of no interference. This is okay, but there are also institution. There are institutional mechanisms that SADC as a regional organization can positively influence the political processes in the region. What we know now is that um, in SADC region, in SADC countries, there is somehow a victimization mentality in terms of looking at internal problems as being boosted by external actors. So
Mm.
this victimization mentality somehow make the member states turn a blind eye to the internal problems that are facing the region and the internal problems that are facing the country members. So it is time for SADC to start looking at the region in terms of drawing a strategy that can make the region stable. Because what is in jeopardy here is the stability of the region. If we are seeing that the protests now are somehow affecting international trade, it means that are affecting all SADC member states. So there is a need of start reflecting the role of SADC in the region, and of somehow reforming the SADC so that it can be as strong as other regional blocks that we have in the world. If you see, for instance, the European Union, if you see the European Union in terms of how it is designed, in terms of cohesion of member states, and in terms of the respect of the democratic institutions, we will see somehow a role model. We are not saying that they are perfect, or there is also a need of tailoring the political dynamics considering the context. But this is to say that we mustn't be experts only in copying bad examples, but we must see what's working in other geographies and how we can implement it in other countries. I don't know what example Mozambique will take from Zimbabwe, from Angola, for instance, because these countries operate in the same authoritarian spheres that Mozambique is operating. We have seen a very positive example in Botswana now.
Mm.
Botswana held elections in the 31st of October. 2 days later, they already had the results, and the incumbent has promised to deliver a peaceful transition. And the transition was very peaceful in Botswana. But now, in the Mozambique case, we held elections in October 9. Till now, we still facing contestations, and we do not have definite results 1 month later. So what's going on? What is the role of the institutions in Mozambique? Why is there such a high level of distrust that boosts violent demonstrations in the streets? I say that because what's happening in Mozambique now is very likely to happen in Angola in the next presidential elections. It's very likely to happen in Zimbabwe in the upcoming elections. So how will the region, how will SADC convene to avoid the very same problems in other countries? So the discussion is around this. We have some examples. Let's comply. Let's go. Let's copy these examples and make institutions work. If institutions are not effective, you cannot expect a different results. This is that the way we are building our institutions in the medium and in the longer term will be bringing the very same results. And at the end, we will not have development in Africa. We will not have a sustainable society. We will not have a peaceful society.
Americo, I mean, and in wrapping up, this discussion, democracy does not start and end with elections, but elections are an indication on how strong the quality of democracy. But equally as important, democracy is experienced in between election cycles. And it is this in between, this 4 year gap in between elections, that citizens gauge whether democracy is being delivered. It is when citizens gauge the quality of democratic governance. And what happens in Mozambique should never be seen in isolation to what's happening in Africa. So what's happening in Mozambique should be everybody's concern and should be everyone's business. We live in a globalized, never mind the fact that we are living in a globalized society and country in which there are spillover effects. One country sneezes, another can catch the cold, or some even catch a full-blown flu. But whatever, and if we are all concerned about the state of democracy from a global perspective, matters like this we should all take heart. Even from an individual perspective, it is easy. It may be difficult to see what kind of impact can I have. We've seen the power of collective activism, and we've seen historically the power that when citizens rally together and also put pressures on their own government to make responses, to make calls, there is a lot of power within unity. And just last off, the last point that I want to make is that even with everything that you have mentioned in terms of the latest developments and what this means from a regional perspective, from a national perspective, I think that, we know that 2024 is dubbed as the election calendar cycle. And I think at the end of 2024, there's a lot of collective introspection that has to be made. It's not all bad cases. We see with Botswana, there are good cases that we have reference points in making. The hope for all of us is that, not only calmness will be restored in Mozambique, but that, this may be the thing that shifts the needle. This may be the thing that, yields effective governance and democracy. Only time will tell, but it is a hope that hopefully this is what this all leads to. But thank you so much once again, Americo, for just availing yourself and just sharing your insights and expertise. I am guaranteed that whoever listens to this, come across this, will have more enriched understanding as to not only enriched understanding as to what is happening, but hopefully it actually challenges everyone from an individual level, just in terms of concerning ourselves with what's happening in Mozambique. Thank you once again.
No, thank you once again for having me in this insightful conversation. And indeed, strong institutions are key to make democracy work. It is time for African countries to deliver the promises of democracy. It is very risky to not do it. And if you look at what's happening in the Sahel region, for instance, we will note that now there are many unconstitutional changes of government. There are many uh, coup d'etats. So it is very dangerous for democracy because when you have unconstitutional changes of government, it is not a guarantee that those in power will be able to make a transition to democracy. And the experiences we are having, not only in Africa, but also in Latin America and other geographies, that these military regimes that take the power by the force tend to be even more authoritarian than the previous regimes. But the key problem here is the way institutions are drawn and the way institutions work. So it is time for African countries build strong institutions so that in the near and in the longer term, we have better societies, we have more social justice and sustainable development. So once again, thank you for having me in this conversation. We will be attentively following the political landscape here in Mozambique, and from times to times, we'll have other conversations. Thank you so much.
Definitely. Thank you. Thank you.